Hey everyone, today I want to talk about podcast ad networks, and I want to talk about the pros and cons of them. I have had some personal experience through clients with different podcast networks. I previously managed a podcast network, but these are just some things that I've seen that I think would be good to know for anyone who is either concerned about joining a podcast network or you are looking for how you can grow your podcast or monetize your podcast. There are just a few things I want to hit on here. The first one is actually something that I really like about podcast networks, and this is the use of cross promotion. When I was working on the Punk Rock MBA, which is a music podcast, there were some shows out there where we paid to promote on them, but once the show joined a podcast network that had all music shows with maybe a couple exceptions, we were able to then run ads on all of those shows at no cost to us. And it was something where, you have someone listening to these similar types of shows already. So you're just trying to hit this broader audience that maybe doesn't know that your specific show exists. So for instance, with the Punk Rock MBA, the ads were running on other music shows like the X-Man with Doc Coyle, and you have just this network of shows. And I believe at the time when we joined the network, there were maybe 10 other shows, and it just kept growing from there. So then it was getting put on more and more podcasts. And so the host of the Punk Rock MBA was reading the ad for the Punk Rock MBA cross promotions. So you were hearing each host of each individual podcast read the ad. And this is a bit different than the cross promotion I usually talk about, because the cross promotion I usually tell people to start with is where you do an ad swap with someone. So for instance, I am running an ad swap with a podcast called Feed the Queue, and I will be doing an ad read for Feed the Queue, and they will be doing an ad read for the podcast life. So that's a bit different because that feels like more of a recommendation coming directly from the host. So I will be telling people to go listen to this other podcast versus just hearing them talk about their own podcast on my show. And I think either way, cross promotion is great. If it's host read, even better. But I think this is a good way for people to grow their audience, and it's not costing you anything. You have a deal with the podcast network, but they're not charging you to, run these cross promotion ads on other shows. At least they should not be. And that is really just a plus on the growth side of things. Obviously, you have to find a podcast network that really fits. There are some out there, like I said, this one was just all music podcasts, and there are others that have a bunch of different genres, and you'll see business, music, TV, film podcasts all on the same podcast network. But that doesn't mean they're going to target audiences that don't fit for your podcast. Those will typically be more targeted to specific genres that are either exactly the same as your show or very similar that there's crossover listeners with. So that is the big pro for a podcast network. And every once in a while, you will find a podcast network that will also help you with booking guests if you're doing an interview show and things like that. So that's something to just keep an eye out for if that is something that they offer and if that is something that you're looking for help with. You will also occasionally get feed drops, which are a little different than cross-promotion ad reads. So this is when, for instance, I work on a show called Fast Politics, and I saw that a podcast trailer had posted for a new podcast called Spolitics, which is a sports politics podcast. And as someone who was familiar with the host of the podcast already and is interested in sports, I checked out that trailer thanks to that feed drop. And now it's one of the podcasts that I'm listening to fairly regularly. So there are things like that that you can also do within a podcast network that you might not be able to easily do otherwise. It's not impossible, but you don't have to do as much outreach if there are already these shows on the podcast network. However, now we've come to what I feel is a downside at times to podcast networks, and that is on the monetization side. So in my experience, what I have seen happen is podcasts have joined networks under the impression that, the podcast network is going to be selling the ads directly for them. And then what happens is they either don't have the connections to sell the ads directly, and they end up hiring out a third-party ad company to secure ad deals for the podcast network. And typically these will be blanket deals that are covering a wide variety of shows on the network. They will be typically sponsors more like Casper, BetterHelp, that can cover a wide range of podcasts, especially for those networks that I mentioned previously that have a bunch of different categories or genres of podcasts. And what happens then is that company is taking a percentage. To make things easy, we'll keep the percentages the same. So for instance, they'll take 30% and the podcast network will get 70%, but then the podcast network will still take their 30% out of that, even though they technically weren't the ones who facilitated the deal. And then you are basically getting what is left of that percentage. And if you are going into this thinking that they are selling ads directly and you're just going to get 70% of whatever comes in, that's not always the case. And that can be frustrating for people who are partnering with a podcast network for the first time. So if you are looking at joining a network, that's just something to inquire about. Be like, hey, do you guys use any third-party ad companies? Are you selling the ads directly? Because there are times when it'll be both. And so you'll see a higher percentage from the direct deals than you would for these ones that are coming from third-party companies. So that's just something to keep an eye out for, because I worked with quite a few podcasters who got in that situation and they weren't very happy with the amount of money that was coming in because of these types of circumstances where, the money was getting split multiple times instead of just the once. There are reasons that a podcast network is beneficial, as I mentioned earlier. I just wanted to share my personal experience with them. So that is all I have for you today. I will be doing a mailbag episode for this podcast soon. So if you have any questions about podcasting, drop your question in the comments. I will be sure to check it out and answer it as best as I can for you. And if I don't get to everything, I will save it for a future mailbag episode. I do want to answer as many questions as I possibly can for all of the listeners and just give you guys more advice and share my experiences with you. So thank you all for watching. And if you want to know more about podcast monetization, check out my episode with Ray Harkins if you haven't yet already.